Good morning, everyone. Welcome.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So glad to have you all here. All right, Sydney.
All right, let's kick this off. Good morning again, everyone, and welcome to Decoding Philly's Digital Divide. I'm Sidney Hargro, president of Philanthropy Network, and I'm really excited to be here this morning representing Philanthropy Network and in partnership with Independence Public Media Foundation. I want to thank Independence Public Media Foundation for their ongoing partnership and particularly for designing and curating this morning's session. You know, digital equity is yet another of the many issues that existed prior to COVID-19 pandemic, but was spotlighted into our consciousness as the variety of inequity, examples of inequity surfaced for all to see. This was also very much evident as it related to the businesses as well as our schools going virtual last year. And one of the things that is a thread that I will run through the session, I think, today is that regardless of funding priority, regardless of grant-making area or our mission, digital equity impacts the achievement of the goals of philanthropy across the board. It affects all of us. And certainly affects all of our communities. And it stands as a major obstacle that regardless of your area of interest, you should really look at opportunities of how to advance equity in this space. I'm thankful certainly for the many funders in this region that stepped outside of their grant-making area last year to really look at funding and addressing digital equity. Many of them are Philanthropy Network members and even others. I'm also excited to say this morning, just before we get started, that IPMF plans to announce an open call for digital equity related proposals next month. This is one element of a variety of ways that they are trying to really address these issues. Now, in full disclosure, I am also a proud IPMF board member, and I'm really excited to see this happen. So with that, I am going to hand it over to Nuala Cabral. Nuala.
Thank you, Sydney. My name is Nuala Cabral. I'm program officer at the Independence Public Media Foundation. We support community media in the region, in the Philly region. And we're really excited to be in a phase of learning around digital equity. And what a time, right, to be looking at this, this issue, which has impacted so many people. And I'm really excited about this panel of experts. Some folks are local and others are in Chicago and DC. And I'm really also excited about our moderator, Francella Ochillo. So I'm just going to quickly introduce her and she will then turn it over to the panel. So Francella is an attorney, a digital rights advocate, a public policy leader. She's executive director at Next Century Cities, which is a nonprofit coalition that brings cities together to support local efforts to increase broadband access and adoption. And so really looking forward to the expertise that she brings to this space and really looking forward to what everyone here has to say about what we should know in funding circles, what we should know and understand as we aim to support this area and ensure that that communities, particularly communities that are already impacted by inequality, that they have access to a very important, a very critical tool that is really clearly should not be a luxury, but is really a utility. So Going to pass it over to Francella. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nuala, for such a warm welcome. And I want to highlight something that you just said about us being in a phase of learning. I've been working on digital equity for many years. I've been working on it before it was cool. And I think that a lot of people would agree that it doesn't matter how many years you're working on this, we are always learning something new about ways to not only talk about how we can make an impact and not just checking the boxes in terms of productivity, but being able to measure progress and also showing how can we not only be agents of change, but empower other people to be agents of change, because we need to expand the circle on who is working on solutions and really be intentional about bringing in thought partners who are among not only the foremost and celebrated policy thinkers, but also the people who can give you real life, community level lived experience that could at least inform better policy. So I couldn't be more excited today to introduce the panelists that I'll get the opportunity to really just be a guide in sharing some of the things that they know, some of the things that they've learned, and really being a partner in dreaming about what we can do together. So starting in alphabetical order, I will turn it over to Mr. Andrew Buss just to give a short introduction.
Thanks, Francella. Hi, everyone. My name is Andrew Buss. I'm a Deputy CIO for Innovation at the City's Office of Innovation and Technology. We do a number of different things in our group: innovation capacity, communications, user experience design, and digital equity is one of those. And that's actually the topic I've been working on the longest. So, you know, Francella said back when this was not yet cool, I also was working on it and pretty interested in it. And I sort of think of there being three key moments in the city's sort of development around digital equity. One is going back to the Key Spot Public Computing Center network, back from the last recession that we funded and still happening today. Moving forward about 5 years to the Digital Literacy Alliance with the goal of seeding some innovation in the space. And then just recently my involvement with PHL Connect Ed, which is really a subsidized program for K through 12 internet access. So that's kind of how I got into the space. And it's been, you know, as Sidney said, just kind of amazing to see how it has really taken over the conversation in the last year or so. So I'll leave it at that, Francella.
That's great. And I will turn it over to Sylvie Gallier Howard, who is also formerly of government, also has a soft spot for nonprofits, who is very seasoned in this space.
Thanks, Francella. Good morning, everyone. I'm Sylvie Gallier Howard. I am the founder and CEO of a company called Equitable Cities Consulting. And my focus is really on building equitable cities through inclusive and equitable economic development. So really my background is mostly in workforce and small business development. But I recently had the opportunity to work for the United Way to do a pretty intensive body of work around looking at the assets and gaps in digital equity and digital resilience in Philadelphia. And fundamentally, you know, I learned a lot, and really digital equity is kind of a backbone for all of these things. And it's really, at the end of the day, the work that I do is about access and opportunity. And if people don't have access to the internet nowadays, they're not going to have access to opportunity. So I'm really happy to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And then finally, last but certainly not least, Chance Williams has actually been a consultant to other funders, and he has really been thoughtful in terms of launching new projects, supporting projects, and making sure that this digital equity space has been accessible to lots of different groups. So Chance, if you'll share a little bit about yourself.
Sure, good to be with you all. So I'm a program officer at the Ford Foundation with the Technology and Society program. And, you know, the organizing principle of the Ford Foundation is addressing inequality. And certainly what we see with access to technology is that it is not equally distributed. And in the Technology and Society program, our work is really focused on the intersection of technology and social justice. And what we know is that technology, even though it is so often presented as a magic cure for so many social ills, the development and distribution of technology directly reflects the social issues that we remain unresolved. And so we've been supporting this work at the Ford Foundation perhaps since before it was cool. And we focus on national organizations that are really working at the FCC and in Congress to advance ideas and policies that will, address the digital divide.
Thank you so much for that, Chance. And we're going to start this conversation by turning back to something that Andrew shared originally, since you've been working in this field for many years. When you're thinking about looking at that digital equity landscape, what's different now as opposed to 10 years ago? And also from your vantage point, what are the issues and also maybe even ideas for organizations that still really need philanthropic investment?
Yeah, so there's a couple things that come to mind that's different now versus 10 years ago. One is that, you can't really overstate the importance of this, I don't think, but it's that we now have a low-income internet option in the form of Internet Essentials. We talk a lot about Comcast and are they doing enough? Should they do more? But I think you cannot really underestimate how important that was because we did not have a $10 option a number of years ago. You had instead a $50 or $60 basement option, which is considerably more. So that's one thing. Another would be, I think, simply the proliferation of mobile devices over the last 10 years. It's sort of presumed that everyone has a mobile device now, and perhaps that's true. But I think what happened, particularly over the last 5 or 6 years, is people sort of fell in love with mobile, as I describe it. And it became assumed that, well, if you have internet connectivity on your mobile device, you're good, right? You're all set. And our position has always been in the city, and those of us doing this work, that you need internet access more beyond the mobile device, right? You can't do all the things most likely that you need to do in the course of your life on simply a mobile device. So I think it's sort of taken the conversation away to some extent by focusing on mobile. So we're trying to bring it back to a little more multifunctional devices at this point in time. And then I would say a third thing that stands out is perhaps we just have a much bigger group of people working on this now. We've all kind of alluded to that through the discussion so far. You often hear about political parties wanting to grow their tents, right, to be bigger. And the tent has grown, particularly over the last year and a half or so. And I think that's quite interesting because it does come down, a lot of this work comes down in my mind to capacity. Like there have to be people working on it, thinking about it, implementing things, testing new ideas for this to really succeed. And then Francella, to the second part of your question there, 2 things really stand out to me. One is really the need for devices, and that goes to my mobile argument earlier. I think we've really found that, we've been talking about connectivity, internet connectivity for quite a while now, perhaps talking less about devices and whether people have the right devices where they can actually partake of this internet connectivity and do a lot of the things that they need to do. So I think there is definitely a device shortage out there. I think that's something we're working to address in the city now through a couple of programs. And then the other piece that I think is interesting as far as potential support is more programmatic, and it's really media literacy. I think we've seen, during the last election and then in the COVID and vaccine process, I think just the importance of good information and knowing what is good, reliable information. So I think there's probably a lot of opportunity out there for funders to really think about opportunities to figure out how you improve media literacy among people. And that sort of gets all the way down to basic literacy, to digital literacy, and then moving to media literacy. So I'll end there with that.
I think that's actually a very important point that I actually haven't heard in a long time. And one thing I want to point out is that people who have limited access to broadband rely on whether it's public TV, public radio disproportionately to get information. So I think that question about being able to have media literacy overall and not just digital literacy is a very important point. Shifting a little bit, Sylvie, I am very interested in your thoughts, especially since you've been working on projects in and around around Philadelphia for years, and you've probably identified some things that could inform not only the work that's in Philadelphia, but also in cities nearby. Can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on gaps in digital literacy, digital navigation, and also things that you know about training the workforce? And I do want to point out just a fact that over 60% of the workforce will at some point in their career rely on digital access to do some sort of training moving forward. So this is very much a workforce issue.
Yeah, thank you for that. So just as a little bit of context, the study that I did, I talked to over 60 individual stakeholders that included national experts, employers, participants of workforce, tech workforce development programs and digital literacy. And so a whole lot of different folks, and ended up with almost like a forensic study. And what I learned, definitely want to piggyback on what Andrew said. So at first, the topic was sort of called digital literacy because we always refer to it as that. But immediately, as I started talking to organizations that have worked in that space for years, they were all looking at how to get devices to their clients and how to get them connected because they can't do digital literacy without access to a device. So I think that going from, computer labs are great, but really to the extent that we can get computers in people's homes, that's going to really be a necessity that people actually own a device. They're not that expensive anymore. I talked to some great refurbishing programs that are doing workforce development with folks, training them how to repair and recycle computers, and getting computers into refurbished computers, which can be better sometimes than new devices in people's homes. So there's a lot of opportunity around that. As our starting point, cities really need to have a lead agency that is focused on digital equity. And I think there's, and I have to really commend the city of Philadelphia because they've actually really been kind of taking the lead, especially since COVID hit, in terms of developing programs to get refurbished devices and the PHL Connected program to get kids connected to devices and internet. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, for sustainability and longevity, because as you point out at the beginning of this program, Francella, this is going to evolve and we can't even foresee all the needs and where this is going to go. So there needs to be an entity thinking about that every morning, when they wake up and when they go to bed. And then, workforce jobs more and more and more are going to involve the need for having a connected device, for digital literacy, for tech skills. And unfortunately, I think in Philadelphia, K through 12, our schools are not where they need to be. I'm sure lots of schools are not where they need to be. It needs to be part of the curriculum. Computer science and learning how to use computers and digital literacy has to really be part of the curriculum and exposing kids to careers. I talked to 11 or 12 different programs that do coding and boot camps and teach people how to do tech help desk. And these professions, everybody that I talked to that had gone through the program, the world was their oyster. They all saw opportunities ahead. And there's a lot of career ladders. That's a first for me, but I'll pick it back up. So just to close out, I think that just the final thing is when there have been kind of multi-year funding initiatives, a lot has happened. And, the key spots are a real example of that. And I think, in a room of funders, I just want to say that having multi-year funding for this it makes a difference.
Thank you for sharing that. And I want to turn to Chance, just picking up a little bit, but thank you for sharing that. I was thinking a lot about something that Sidney said earlier when he was talking about how digital equity impacts a variety of philanthropic goals and how this essentially goes across, and tying that even back to something that Sylvie said, that it wasn't enough for a city to just have a broadband office, but somebody actually leading digital equity. I think a lot about when we think about this being a multifaceted issue. The people who are struggling with food insecurity, housing insecurity are probably struggling with broadband access. People who are, working on criminal justice, there is no justice if you can't do your online hearing. And so when we're thinking about it, it has tentacles in so many different places. For years, I think that Ford Foundation has been a leader on acknowledging those intersections between social justice and tech. So when you are giving advice to people who might be new to this field or really thinking about what's our next move in terms of investing, can you share examples of what are things people should be thinking about when they are evaluating whether it's time to start investing in digital equity work, and also what should they be using as benchmarks for success?
Sure. And I think the place that we really start from is that technology isn't something that happens to people, that people and communities have agency and should be able to shape the way that technology impacts their lives. And that's why for us, we focused so much on supporting organizing and advocacy to advance policy change, to really look at the structural issues that have shaped the outcomes that have gotten us where we are today. And so that is, I think, a piece that is critical because as we see over time, it's not enough just to get people access to the internet or devices, because once you do that, you are inviting communities into an entire world of new risks, new concerns. And so how can we support folks to make sure that not only are we thinking about getting people online, but helping them to understand how to protect their privacy and the policies that connect to that. And so that's why we've always sort of focused on building a community of organizations that really work together to address the range of issues and concerns. But when it comes to social justice and the way that Ford looks at this, we do work across programs because we recognize it's not just about the tech. It's not really about the tech. It's about how the tech impacts people's lives and the issues that they're concerned about. And so when we think about benchmarks, earlier folks were talking about the importance of multi-year support. And I think that as we look at this, we're really addressing this. This is generational, right? We can't expect communities to solve these problems in, a couple of years. I think we can make tremendous progress, but there's always more to do. So we've really focused on the long term and the big picture here, recognizing that while there are gains, there's always retrenchment. We've seen it happen before, big wins that, then are undone. So what we really, I think, measure as much as anything is resilience and supporting organizations in a way that allows them to be that, because taking on a problem of this size and scale is something that requires long-term support.
Thanks for that, Chance. And even really talking about the enormity of this, I think that turning to Andrew, thinking about how that it's just difficult to track who's not connected, who doesn't have a device. I saw a question in the chat that was teasing, not only the device security, and even if you get a device, is it secure? There's so many questions that are related to even if we can get the device into these households. And in general, when we think about broadband access, I think a lot of the times the conversation is about, does someone have proximity to the digital infrastructure without digging into all of the additional dimensions when you get that technology across the front door threshold? So we're thinking about digital literacy, skills, security, surveillance. There's all sorts of issues that are invoked there. Can you tell me a little bit about the things that still concern you that maybe we don't talk about as often, but should definitely get attention? Even though we're in the spirit of thinking about affordability and access, what are those other things that are tugging at you when you talk about digital equity?
Yeah, sure. So I think there are a couple other challenges, and Francella, I think you're right to go beyond just basic access, because as I said earlier, that's kind of the point we had gotten stuck on for a number of years and not quite gotten to the digital literacy side of things. So I might start the conversation by saying what I do not think is a barrier any longer, which is the relevance concept. I know leading up to the pandemic, you would see studies saying, well, it's affordability that is a problem. Other studies would say, well, it's relevance. People don't understand why they need the internet. I find it very hard to believe after the last year and 3 months or whatever that people now do not think they need some version of the internet. There's just too many things that you have to do. So I think the relevance argument is sort of fallen aside now, certainly. I think there are, I sort of mentioned literacy earlier, and I think of it almost in 3 layers, right? Where basic literacy is a tremendous barrier to digital literacy, because you have to have that basic literacy in order to get to the point, I think, of being digitally literate. And then if you add something like media literacy onto there, you are requiring that these basics are in place. So I think Philadelphia has a big challenge with basic literacy. And I think, you know, getting to digital literacy is sort of the next step. I would say language barriers are also pretty notable, certainly over the last decade. Philadelphia has gotten a lot more ethnically diverse. We have a lot more languages spoken here, and language turns out to be a pretty significant barrier, I think, again, to both basic literacy and digital literacy. And then I think probably also, I don't know what you would say, ease of uptake or something like that. So if you get an Internet Essentials connection from Comcast, you still have to figure out how to get it to work, right? I think the instructions are pretty good, but I still think that's a pretty high hurdle for a lot of people. Again, going back to that basic literacy and digital literacy, if you don't have those skills, it's hard to get that to work for you well, I think. So sort of the ease of uptake, or just knowing that you have a lot of other things going on, and you know you're going to have to spend like 2 to 3 hours to get your internet connection to work. So those are some of the things that come to my mind.
So Sylvie, thinking about something that's a little bit of a hybrid of the things that Chance and Andrew brought up, and Chance brought up something that actually came up with a local official that I was talking to in New York last week, talking about multi-generational literacy. And they were talking about, much like financial literacy in wealthy families, there are actually healthy habits, you know how to use tools. Those things are native to you because you practice them in your home, and someone that is either above or below you can actually teach you something in your home. And when you're thinking about your work with local governments, nonprofits, if we know that this is a multi-generational issue, to Chance's point, that can't be solved just in our generation, and we also know that it's a pervasive issue that touches a lot of other things, whether it's criminal justice, food insecurity, housing insecurity, and all of these things, what exactly should local governments be essentially focused on in order to really think about solutions that are targeted when we know how amorphous it is?
Yeah, so I think that the key is sort of finding the intermediary or the touch point that can really help with that. And so, so for example, I mean, last year, or throughout the last year and change, all of the programs that government has had to stand up, all of these emergency programs, they've all had to be through the internet. All the applications have had to be online. And so, for example, when I was leading the Commerce Department, we did a couple different emergency relief grant programs for small businesses. And when we did the first one, because city government requires tax, clearances, you can't be delinquent on your taxes, and you have to show a payment plan. It's just one of the rules. People had to send, certain financial materials. We tried to make it as easy as possible, but a lot of people, they didn't know how to send those documents. They didn't have access to PDFs or a scanner. And so we engaged intermediaries, CDFIs, community development finance institutions, and small business entities. And we basically had them proactively reach out, and even just to say, you can come and scan your document, or we'll help you with that particular component. With workforce development, I would talk to Philadelphia Works, our local entity here, our local WIB, and, talk about, well, what do we do with all these people that are now out of jobs, and how do we, reskill or upskill? And he would say to me, the leader would say to me, it's all the training's online. It's all online. And, and if people don't have access to a computer, and we don't even know how to, that's not we don't under our purview to get people computers and internet access. And so, you have, it's, in that case, then you have to figure out, how are you partnering with a refurbisher, or how are you partnering with an entity focused on that particular issue? I mean, we saw it with the schools. The schools are not set up to get kids access to the internet, but they became part of that, right? And then I think the last thing is just, to your point about, a lot of younger people are on their phones, they know how to use a lot of these things, and figuring out, how do we make them ambassadors, and how do we sort of formalize something so that they, maybe they're compensated in some way to be a community advocate and to get people connected, because they have the closest sort of physical connection and understanding of their community, and can be the biggest help. So you have to get really creative.
Thanks for that. And I do appreciate being creative. And I will say, my organization, we've been in touch with a municipality every single week since April of 2020. And one of the things that we have learned is that the most successful cities were all treating it as an intergovernmental issue. So they had someone either playing point or working in different aspects and actually putting out their digital literacy plans or digital equity plans and asking every single department, what are you doing to make sure that that is a part of your work? So to your point about being creative and making sure you're pulling in new partners, I completely agree with that. Chance, I wanted to turn to you because there was something that, as I was thinking about an artful way to really think about bringing up the moment that we're in. And I think a lot, there was something that kind of, even when Andrew brought up at the beginning, how the ideas about access to wireless have changed. I do know that when I first entered this space, it was very much a movement between cell phone access was not equivalent to desktop, which I still agree with that premise. But I think that one of the things that is important is part of the reason why we're in this moment with people asking for equality and equity is because people were able to capture certain things on their cell phones and able to actually elevate their stories in their own words, whether it be on social media, documenting it on the internet. Part of the only reason why we're here and demanding this type of accountability is because they were able to actually have the access, the digital literacy, and really the gumption to say, this is what we're asking for. When you think about the need to respond to that, and you think about how digital equity plays a role in all of the social, political, really rethinking a multi-generational, multiracial democracy, how does investing in digital equity fit into that work?
Thank you for that gigantic question.
I do my best. You can take it and break it down in parts, but I wanted to make sure I got all of my thoughts out.
I mean, it's you nailed it, and I think we at Ford, and particularly with the Technology and Society program, as the pandemic emerged, as the uprisings for racial justice began to be more prominent, I think we have reflected on our work and really, in some ways, recognized that where we have been, the way that we have organized our work, really centering equity and racial justice, really looking at inequality and supporting organizations that are that take that very seriously. In some ways, it's the things that are now visible to folks we have been focused on for a long time, and I think that doesn't mean that we are perfect and we're resting on our laurels, but I think it did make us want to go deeper and think about communities that we haven't supported, the sort of the gaps in our strategy, and also supporting innovation and vision. This is a very intense moment. And it's also a moment that is filled with opportunity. We have a federal government that has just passed legislation that is going to provide a $50 subsidy to folks who can't afford broadband access. That's massive. There is talk about the infrastructure bill really including a lot of opportunities around broadband access and affordability, and some really big thinking there. And so so many things that I think folks didn't think were possible are now becoming a reality. And we want to be supporting folks to continue to push further. What is the next thing? And how can we, again, make sure that organizations are resilient and have the energy to really take the work to the next level in a time like this when we're all so exhausted. But there's still so much more to be done.
So Sylvie and Andrew, I gave Chance a gigantic question that I'll kind of ask you to follow up on some of the things that he said into two pieces. So Sylvie, I'll start with you. When we're thinking about specifically something that Chance just said about supporting innovation and vision, there is a policy side of that in terms of what do we need to do to make sure that that's possible in terms of policy and funding. And then Andrew, I'll turn to you to talk about the mechanics of what can we do on the ground with community level organizations and others.
So, I mean, I think that in terms of supporting innovation, you have to be really intentional about that. And I think that, you know, when it comes to funding, whether it's government or philanthropy, it's really making sure that we're positioning the broad theme of what we want to achieve and then inviting in proposals that have, you know, pilots or creative ideas and things that we may not have thought of. So I think the Digital Literacy Alliance is a really great example of that, in that, you know, they really look to fund innovative things that are untested, you know. So I think that that's one way in terms of policy. I think the other thing I really love, and this is, I guess, more of a policy at a funding level, but I love what the Philanthropy Network has done recently with the community investment advisors, in terms of having local leaders that are being paid a stipend to help with the decision-making around funding. This is for COVID emergency response funding. But I think having that be sort of part of the protocol is, you know, that's, I mean, in ways it's kind of revolutionary, you know. So I think it's sort of really being, again, it has to be intentional, because a lot of what hamstrings, I know from having been a nonprofit leader, people are trying to make change is being tied to lots of regulations and rules, or, you know, where things are just too narrowly defined and not having the space to try to innovate and do different things.
Thanks for that, Sylvie. And Andrew, I'll turn to you just to talk about what you think is the community level investments or issues and things that we can do to support that.
Yeah, so I think about whenever it was 5 years ago that we had the opportunity to create the Digital Literacy Alliance. I think the reason we made it what it was because we believe that it was really these smaller community organizations that knew the space really well, that had a lot of these creative ideas, that already had kind of built-in populations that they were serving. And I think I alluded to it earlier. I think the conversation around access and adoption became kind of stale for a while, in that it was framed only as a connectivity and affordability argument. So it didn't really get into digital literacy at all. So I think when we make these small grants to organizations, our thought was that, and I think we've seen that, was you try to seed some interesting ideas, eventually some best practices, and it is really those smaller organizations that are able to do this best. So it's the sort of the city as the convener model again, I suppose. It's interesting too, if I look back at the grants we've made, I don't think, you know, I'm talking about the innovation idea here. I don't think you would look at a lot of them and say, oh, wow, that's a wild and crazy out of the box idea. And I think that's perfectly fine, because what you find in the innovation space usually is a lot of those wild and crazy ideas cannot be implemented. So to Sylvie's comment about having to be kind of practical about innovation, well thought, you really have to think about whether you can implement something. So, you know, testing tablet training for seniors, or teaching immigrants how to use social media to help their own businesses. Those are ideas that are not like wild and crazy, I don't think, right? But I think they're important, and I think they're things that often have not really been done or not done that well. So the thing I'm thinking about a lot now kind of on the ground is almost from the supply side of user experience design, or the supply side of digital literacy, right? Because we talk a lot about clients and digital literacy and how they need certain skills to do all the things that they need to do. We don't often talk about it on the other side, which is, what are they trying to do? And are the applications and websites and all these other places they're trying to go and use, are they usable? So I think there's a tremendous opportunity out there now to create usable content that people can use, and they don't have to be technologists to do it. So, you know, at the city, we have a really strong user experience group and a content group, and they're trying to make content and materials accessible for people who are not technologists. And there's kind of, at some point you want to meet these two, right? Where the clients have the skills necessary, and then what they're trying to use is usable, and you reach a point in the middle where people can use and they are digitally literate. So it goes on both sides, I think.
Thank you for that. And I do want to make sure that before we open it up for Q&A, and I'll turn it over to Mariah to do that. And I also see the comments from Bread and Roses and First Person Arts. Thanks for that. I wanted to give the panelists just to give their closing thoughts, just really succinctly on where we go from here. And just to preface that, it's my impression when I do a lot of reading, talking to people, traveling, a lot of the reason why we've had to fight so hard for digital equity, especially when it came to broadband access and adoption initially, was really because advocates were not leading the narrative. A lot of, whether it's tech and telecom companies, have the resources to essentially create a narrative, support that narrative, make sure that people have talking points and support that. They can do great commercials and great talking points on social media. And public interest advocates then have to be in a reactive posture to say, hold on a second, that's not reaching everybody and everybody doesn't have access. So that's part of the reason why we're in this moment. And the reality of it is that, quite frankly, companies have the space to dream. They have the resources. And so when we're thinking about whether it's local governments or community organizers and what we really want, looking 5 and 10 years away from now, just like companies would do in their ideation process, they get around a room and ask for ideas. When you're thinking about ideas, the best ideas that we should be chasing after, bringing people in the room to really support ideation, what does that look like? And so I'll start with Chance, just to think about, if we were to talk about this 10 years from now, what is it that you want, or what is it that we should be working towards?
You know, I think I go back to sort of where I started, and investing in the agency of communities to shape technology. I think the more we do that, the better the outcomes. At Ford, in the Technology and Society program, we have a field-led strategy, which I think in so many ways really boils down to trust. We know that we can't possibly know all of the things that you need to about technology, but we do support organizations that are filled with very kind and smart people who are doing amazing work and who have their finger on the pulse. And we do support organizations that are part of and deeply engaged in the most impacted communities. And so for me, I think supporting those folks and listening more deeply and following their lead.
Thanks for that, Chance. And I'll turn to Andrew next.
Yeah, so I think I have maybe an immediate goal and a 5-year goal and a 10-year goal. And it's most immediately, I really view all of our work in digital equity is included through the lens of capacity building. So, you know, it's really exciting to me now, after doing this work for a while, that the city of Philadelphia essentially has a digital equity, I don't know if it's an office, but it's a function. It is dedicated resources to doing this work. We've never had that before. I see a lot of other cities doing that as well. And I think that's what it's going to take to keep the focus on the issue, because someone said this earlier on the panel that, you know, I think that we had a recession 10 years ago, the focus was on it. And then I think when the economy improved, people kind of forgot about it. So I'd like to keep the focus on it, see what happens over the next 5 years. And then, you know, ideally in 10 years, we wouldn't have the need for a digital equity office. You know, I don't know that that's really not pie in the sky, but I think we have a great opportunity now over the next 5 to 10 years to really reduce the challenge in this area, as long as we're doing the work, trying the ideas, working with the communities on the ground to implement things.
That's outstanding. Sylvie?
So, when I was doing this study, I felt really privileged that I was sort of hearing all these different ideas and these different perspectives. And one of the things I kept thinking is, are these folks talking to each other and hearing these perspectives from each other? And there's so many people honestly doing great work. But if they were united, and thinking about where the gaps are and where they can collaborate, I think it could be that much more powerful. And I think that, again, in Philadelphia specifically, if a lead agency was sort of seated to and really did a stakeholder engagement process that involves, certainly, government, nonprofits, employers, beneficiaries of these types of programs. When I heard from the beneficiaries, you learn things that you thought, I wonder how much that feedback is getting back to the folks that are providing the programs. And mostly they're very happy, but there were little things that could really, be tweaked. So I think having those conversations and making sure that all of those perspectives are at the table and coming up with what are the broad themes, and thinking big. So it's digital equity with workforce, digital equity with education, digital, whatever, all the topics. And just trying to imagine the unimaginable, to the extent possible, so that to prepare for whatever could come, so that what happened to us, in this past year doesn't, that we're really more ready for whatever could come.
So I'm with Sylvie about chasing after preparing for the unimaginable. And so I just really appreciate being able to pick your brains and have you share your thoughts. Now I'd like to turn it over to Mariah to lead our Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, for the great questions and responses so far. So for everyone, for all of our participants, if you have a question, please put it in the chat or raise your hand and I'll start calling on you. And while you formulate your questions, I'll just share a bit more about what I was asking in the chat. And thanks, Jamie, for asking for clarification. So basically, I think as Sylvie was just saying, digital equity is so broad. I was just curious how many of you feel like you actually do that work, even though maybe you already are doing it and this event has kind of made you reconsider that? Or are some of you here to learn more about what is this and how do I start to become involved? So I was just trying to get a sense of why all of you were here today. And let's see, I don't see any questions coming in yet. I'll give it another second. Oh, okay. Great comment from Melissa about what Leeway does. One question that, did come up. Oh, Molly. Great.
Mariah, you can go ahead and finish that thought.
I was just it was more specific around the intergenerational nature of this. So, we have one participant who works with different generations and that came up in one of the comments. So I was just curious, what are the implications for that? Is there a target generation? How do you think through families and their situations? So maybe that we could start there.
So I think it's interesting to think about other populations because, obviously our focus over the last year or so has really been specifically on K through 12, right? Because there was that immediate need there. And I think what we're trying to do internally now, knowing that there are other populations that are sort of falling through the gaps perhaps, is to really develop a broader digital equity strategy that we all keep talking about. And we're currently doing a benchmarking study to identify some of these populations of need. And that's exciting for the city too, because we've not been able to do that. We've really relied on outdated data now for quite a while. So I think what will end up happening is that we will sort of move beyond K through 12 and start thinking about how we consider digital equity with other populations.
At this point too, and I would also open it up to the participants. If you have thoughts on any of these issues, maybe not even necessarily a question, but you hear something that sparks you and you want to say something, please feel free to go ahead and unmute yourselves and share as well.
I do want to just point out, because I would be remiss to not bring librarians up in this conversation. When I think about local officials, they are the community partner that is steadfast. The ones who help set up email accounts, the ones who walk people through filing their taxes, the ones who help people apply for COVID relief. And I think that it's really hard for me to imagine any sort of community level solution without rethinking how we engage and partner with librarians, because thinking about the tensions of they are the place for the most low income populations. In general, we know that at least 1/3 and probably closer to half of families that live at or below the poverty line rely on their local library for reliable access. So if they rely on the librarians for reliable access, they are also turning to librarians for digital skills support, digital literacy training, and really to get information from trusted messengers. So I do want to make sure that in any sort of strategies that we're thinking about, even if you aren't funding librarians, how are we engaging with librarians to extend the impact of the work?
Yeah, they're a really important piece for so many different things.
Yeah, I think that's right, Francella. I think I might also add some parks and rec facilities. In some ways, in my mind, parks and rec facilities are becoming kind of more like libraries in that they are trusted community organizations or locations. And, you know, with the key spot model that we have in Philadelphia, we do have trained people there to help clients who come in and need help with whatever their digital literacy needs are. So I think, to your point, though, those sort of community connections, whether it is a library branch or a parks and rec facility, are incredibly important. And that's how you get into the neighborhoods as much as you do, besides just like a nonprofit or something like that.
I think one thing I would add to that is, so, you know, this idea of digital navigation really cropped up right after COVID hit. And, you know, there's Digital US, this national coalition, created a whole toolbox that anybody can access of guides for folks like librarians or career counselors or case managers, anyone who's working with somebody that needs kind of, that they might need help to help others, right? And I think that that's something, that was another key learning for me, is just that pretty much anybody who's working with a client or in social services is doing some form of digital navigation, and they're not necessarily trained in that. And that, you know, to the extent that there can be a support system so that they can most easily help people with doing the things they used to do on paper, but now they have to do it through, you know, the internet. They may not, you know, it may be through a phone. So helping them, you know, guide folks through that is another key component.
I think, Molly, you had something to say?
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks so much for being here today. Really appreciate this really fascinating conversation. I have a question about policy. Chance, I really appreciated everything you said about supporting, you know, long-term commitment to policy change to get at the root causes of these issues. And I know that in philanthropy, it tends to be on the conservative side of supporting policy, and there are lots of funders who don't fund it at all or just do it a little bit. And I wondered if you had some tips for funders, like what are some entry points for policy? How should funders who don't have experience supporting policy, how should they get started? Or, you know, and I guess another question I have too is, for those of us who are on this, who are local funders, how should we be thinking about local policy versus national policy? And are there national policy efforts that we should be thinking about even though we're local funders?
Sure. So first of all, it's great to see you, Molly. But when it comes to policy, you know, so much happens locally and so much is possible at the local level. And so I think I'm so excited that you all are having this conversation. You know, there are ways that local state policies shape what communities are able to do. For instance, the ability to even build, for a municipality to build their own broadband network when they're not being served by one of the big ISPs. There are laws that make that really difficult in a lot of states. and those are laws that some of the big internet service providers support to maintain their sort of monopoly power. And so I think supporting groups that really bring a power analysis and are thinking about power building and organizing as they're taking on digital equity work is something that is really important. Having that connection to community and also just sort of understanding the dynamics at play and really challenging a willingness to really challenge the status quo.
When it comes to this topic, I would just say the National Digital Inclusion Alliance, I think that I'm sure probably anybody in the space knows them well, but, just a wealth of information there. And then I think the other thing would just be having conversations in terms of local policy with municipal government or state government about what's on your agenda. I think that would be probably the best starting point.
Yeah. And National Digital Inclusion Alliance is great. They're an organization that we work with, and also Next Century Cities, Francella's organization. These kind of networks where people are building together and learning from one another across communities is a really great way to get started.
Thank you for that, Chance. And I just wanted to, I don't want to miss an opportunity in this moment for us to reimagine who gets to develop policy. I think that there are too many times that I am reading a docket and I find out that it's only maybe telecom council and maybe 2 or 3 municipalities, when quite frankly, there should be thousands of municipalities and community groups who, even if it's only just to tell their own story, to actually do a 1-page letter about this is what this feels like in my community, which could actually help shape how a proceeding is actually the outcome of a proceeding. So I think it's really important this moment when we're thinking about power building and we're thinking about changing the dynamics, not only about who gets to like make the recipe and who also gets to determine what are the outcomes. We cannot do this without ordinary citizens who literally have the know-how. Like you tell somebody in a template, send this letter to this email, this proceeding is open, even if it's just a notice in a newsletter or putting it in the town hall meeting. Ordinary citizens help shape what comes up on those agendas. And I remind people of those high school girls in Baltimore who got Comcast to respond to say better speeds, which actually had a ripple effect on the entire nation. And I start with those girls started with a cell phone and literally shaming a company into performance. So I believe that we're in a moment that we can change who gets to develop policy. And I would like to see more community advocates on those dockets.
Yeah, I think I would add on the ground too, Francella, we've talked about the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. That's a great way. That's a great thing to follow, because we often get notes from them saying you guys should provide comments about this particular policy issue going on at the federal level. And that's when we find out and do that.
All right, as we wrap up, just want to check if there's any final questions. Panelists, you can ask each other questions as well. I don't know if there are any follow-ups from all the great answers, but Sally, I think that was a great, almost like closing thought again, that this is all about getting people involved and connected in who has a voice and who gets to shape the future.
So I think I do have a question. Maybe it's for any of the funders on the call. I'm sort of curious about, so one of the things I've always tried to do since I've been working on this issue is really to get funders interested in it. And as I said earlier, that became much easier with the pandemic. Prior to that, and full transparency here, we got a nice grant from IPMF, and that was really, to me, the first funder that had really gotten in the game. So that was pretty cool. But I'm curious what you guys would say kind of, after we move past the pandemic, ideally, are we able to keep this focus on the topic, keep funding some aspect of it? Because I would think that sort of the argument we were making before this, which was, you know, a lot of the programs and initiatives that funders would do that they want to be innovative always require some element of enabling technology in them, I think, right? Whether it's the clients who have to use something, or the, I guess the clients who have to use it, or an organization they're funding that has to provide some sort of technology. I think there's always a technology piece, and it's enabling. And so the focus still should be from the funder's perspective on making sure that, you know, if you're going to fund these programs and initiatives, you have to make sure people can handle the technology to partake of them.
You know, I would say as someone who's been working in philanthropy for, I think, about 7 years now, and always focused on a tech component, that's sort of a perennial issue, is how do you get people's attention? How do you help them understand the way that it connects to the strategies that they're moving forward in their concerns? And I think even at Ford, we've had a major transformation as well in making sure that we're really integrated. Each of the different program teams have a tech fellow who is part of their staff, who helps them sort of vet different proposals or ideas that come through, and also contributes to their strategy and how like technology is really integral to it. But we work with a number of donor collaboratives, and also just some sort of organizing with other funders who are bringing a kind of a tech and social justice lens to the work, to try to get to as many networks and people, and really just being open. You know, I think this moment of awareness around digital equity that came with COVID was, we heard from a lot of funders who really, when we brought these issues up to them before, didn't really, it didn't grab hold for them as much. And so I think we're continuing, as always, to cultivate those relationships, and to just be supportive partners to kind of grow the pot, and to maintain the commitment.
All right, well, I think I'll pass it back to Francella to close this out, but just want to let you know that this is recorded. We'll be posting the recording, and I'll also send out a follow-up email to everyone who has registered with a lot of the great resources and links that were also mentioned in the chat.
So I just want to say thank you so much for organizing this brain trust. I think that this is, again, start going back to the beginning of this conversation, this is something that is going to require ongoing learning. So I encourage all of you, when you are in meetings, think about who is at your table, think about how we can create new perspectives and open it up for diversity of thought in terms of economic, ethnic, and geographic diversity, to make sure that we're gathering as many perspectives as possible. And more than anything, I just appreciate you guys being willing to have this type of conversation, because I think sometimes it's really easy to get stuck in the way we've always done things, without being able to ask questions about what we could be. And what we could be requires that we ask hard questions without it being a criticism or an indictment of the way things were done before, but really to encourage people to imagine something beyond where we are now. So thank you so much for having this conversation. I'll turn it back to Nuala. I just appreciate being included.
Wow, thank you all so much. What a dynamic panel. Really appreciate everyone joining. It's great to see some of our grantee organizations in this Zoom as well. Also want to point out how beautifully you all managed a Zoom bomb, which I personally have never experienced, but thank you. Yeah, you all were masterful with that. So thank you so much. I don't know if Sidney or Molly want to share any last words.
I don't know that I have anything to add. I just, thank you. And this has been super informative, and I really appreciate all the different perspectives. It's going to help inform how we think about our work going forward, and gives us a lot to think about with an upcoming open call we have around this. And we're really looking forward to getting those proposals in and seeing what's out there. So thank you very much.
Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you.